put any questions. Oh, there you go, recording in progress. We're putting everybody on mute so that we don't hear any ambient noises. Please do put questions in the chat box because I do want to have that during the Q&A session. And also please forgive any technical difficulties. They will also put links to purchase copies of The Dressmakers of Prospect Heights, which is an awesome book if you haven't read it. And we will also send it to you via email. So as I said earlier, today marks our final Meet the Author for this year, and it has been such a wonderful experience this year, and I hope you have enjoyed meeting all of the wonderful authors that we've had a chance to speak to as much as I have. This morning, I'm very excited to introduce Kitty Zeldis. She was born in Hadera, Israel. Kitty is actually the pseudonym for an award-winning author of 8 novels and over 35 books for children. Her essays, articles, and short fiction have also been published in many national and literary publications. Kitty is the fiction editor for Lilith magazine, and she is joining us today from Brooklyn, New York. I'm joining us today from Georgetown, Washington, D.C. And for those of us who have not had, so I'd like to just introduce Kitty. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you for inviting me, and thank all of you for being here. I always like to say at the beginning, writers without readers are no one. So I am very gratified that you are taking time out of your undoubtedly busy lives to talk about books, mine in particular. Otherwise, like, what are we doing? You know, I mean, Dottie, whom I introduced earlier, is a peerless companion, but she is illiterate. So, you know, she can't read me.
Well, if you could just kick us off, I loved your story. And if you could tell us a little bit what inspired the story, and also just not everyone has had the opportunity yet to read it. So if you can just kind of bring us up to speed a little bit about what it's about.
This one inspiration comes from a variety of different places. It's never the same. And this book for me was sort of like a challah braided in 2 strands that I needed to put together. The first was New Orleans. A city that I came to love through my husband, who was a photographer, and we would take road trips together. And the first time I went there was in the late 80s, and he was worried that I wasn't going to like it, but I really loved it, and we had a wonderful time. I found it, I don't know how many of you have visited it, but I found it a singular American city because it's really not like any other American city I've ever visited. It has like a very strong European component, French and Spanish, even a little Italian. It has the Cajun thing. It is just filled with history and literature and music and food. Anyway, I was in love with New Orleans. And while I was there, I learned that prostitution was legal in New Orleans. From 1898 or 9, the law was passed maybe in 98 and actually went into effect in 99 through 1917. And this was not because the city had some kind of progressive attitude like towards sex work like they do in Amsterdam. It was because prostitution was so deeply entrenched in the culture and controlled by such vicious and terrifying criminals that the city government felt the only way they could get a handle on this was to actually legalize it in a prescribed area called the district. It was a 38-block radius, and it started at Basin Street, which was a big avenue, and at the time, well, I guess a street, but a big street, and at the time the train pulled in to the station right across from Basin Street. So on Basin Street, there were these magnificent mansions, one more opulent and splendid than the next. And these were brothels, in the windows of which women would pose and simulate various activities trying to entice customers. And as you went further back from the train station, things got like a little seedier and cheaper until finally at the end of it, you would find these one-room structures called shacks. And a woman would be sitting outside in various states of undress, you know, and trying to get a customer for 10 cents, or 5 cents, 20 cents, something like that. So because this was such a big business, it was also decided that they were going to publish a guide, in effect like yellow pages, to this area. And at first it was called the Blue Book. Well, excuse me?
Do they have reviews too, like Yelp reviews?
You know, I don't think they do, but that would have been good. So at first, these things, they were called the Blue Book, and they were the more expensive brothels would advertise, but every worker, every prostitute was listed by her name and age and ethnicity. And very quickly they decided they're not going to sell these things, they're just going to give them away at the train station, at newsstands. So they were very widely available. And I was looking at one of them in the New Orleans Historic Society, and there was a listing for a woman who was 21, Caucasian, and Jewish.
Mm.
This was like kind of a cattle prod to me. I thought, Jewish prostitute, New Orleans, like what? I don't know that story. I have grandparents who are Polish on one side, Russian on the other. You know, I know a lot of immigrant stories. I didn't know about Jewish women who ended up in New Orleans as prostitutes, and I was interested. And because I am a novelist and not a historian, it didn't really, I wasn't inclined to like look her up and
Mm.
find out about her. I wanted to make her up,
Mm.
think about, well, what would have gotten her to that place? Like, how did that happen?
Right.
And apart from the many women and girls that we know were sold, forced into prostitution,
Yeah.
sometimes by their own families, regrettably, but we're putting those women aside. What about women who chose this? Like,
Mhm.
why? What would make you do that? It's not simple poverty, right? There are lots of poor women that don't do that. So I began to construct a backstory for her. And in my mind, she would have been Russian and Jewish. And what I came to kind of understand, or what seemed most resonant to me, was to use my own grandmother's story. Uh, I'm going to say at the outset, I don't even know if my grandmother was ever in New Orleans. She was certainly not a madam or a prostitute,
Yeah.
ever. Anyway, so Grandma, I am clearing your name of that. Um, my grandmother had, and if you read the novel, I used her early life
Mm.
in this
Really.
book. She was, in the years I knew her, a very difficult woman. Um, Small, fierce, prone to rages, hysteria, you know, slamming doors, throwing things. If she got angry, she stayed angry, and I kind of kept away from her. She lived in a different state. I kept my distance. I didn't really like her very much, and she probably didn't like me, although that was never articulated. But
Yeah.
and I was 45 when she died. That is a long time to have your grandmother in your life.
Yeah.
And I was totally unprepared for the torrent of grief and regret that I
Mhm.
felt upon her death. Like, why wasn't I more compassionate? Why wasn't I more patient? I knew certain things about her life. They were terrible. She didn't have access to a certain kind of health care or anybody that would help her through all this. She was a really damaged person and it wasn't her fault. So I began writing about her. And in my writing, I found a way almost to apologize and to give her the kind of dignity and agency that I wasn't able to give her in her life. And I don't have any illusion that she's like looking down from above and able to appreciate this, but it did make me feel better to do this. So I used her early life as part of this character, who begins her life in Russia as Yevgenia and then becomes Beatrice when she finds herself in the United States. And that early trauma really, I felt, informed this character and made her choices sensible. And
Mhm.
the other thing I would like to say about my grandmother that I also found interesting is that unlike the typical Russian Jewish
Mhm.
background, like that my grandfather had, where they lived in a house with a dirt floor and there was one coat that the three siblings shared, my great grandfather was a tanner. And that was a profession allowed to Jews because it was so disgusting. Many
Mhm.
people didn't want to do it. One of the chief components in the tanning process was urine. So we
Mm.
can imagine what that might have been like to work there. And he was a very prosperous man. And my grandmother had described to me a house with parquet floors and velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers that she grew up in. And older sister, she had a big family that had dancing lessons and music lessons, and the boys went to a military academy. Something, again, Jewish boys didn't do in Russia. So my grandfather must have had some influence for that exception to have been made. And she spoke Russian at home. She didn't speak Yiddish. She knew some Yiddish, but hers was a Russian speaking household. So they were very assimilated, though clearly Jews. And I don't know that it's a spoiler to say that her father was murdered in the way that he is murdered in the novel. And
Wow, really?
yes, and this was a story she told me. By the way, when I was pregnant with my first child, probably not the best time to hear that story. I was
Yeah.
already kind of, you know,
Right. Already kind of stressed out about it.
yeah,
Yeah.
or nervous anyway
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
things that could go wrong. But this, so I kind of wove those two strands together. My love for an interest in New Orleans with this kind of problematic family member who was lost to me, and I didn't manage to make amends in her life.
Right. Well, I mean, you definitely made amends in the book, because when I read that on Goodreads, when you told the readers about that background, it was interesting because B is such a forgiving character. She goes out of her way to help Alice and to help all of the people in her orbit as much as she can. And she also is a very resilient character. And so a lot of I mean, I thought there were a lot of themes that I noticed in the book, but one that really struck out was a reinvention, and both reinvention of herself and then reinvention of the clothing, which is what got her to, creating this shop, and just sort of at each stage in her life. So can you talk a little bit about that theme of reinvention and how if that was an important theme for you to weave in the story?
That is a good point. I don't know that I thought about it consciously, but I think it's part of resilience is that when your circumstances change, you have
Mhm.
to change with them. Like if you
Mhm.
remain, if something changes for you radically and you try to go about as if it hasn't, and like in the past, that is going to be much harder for you. And
Mhm.
perhaps that is a quality that many immigrants share, although it takes different forms when they come to a new country, is that they have to find a way to reinvent themselves. And,
Right.
and she does that.
So you talked a lot about the fashion and the way that fashion changed, during the times and sort of in the 20s, and how that also kind of paralleled the lives of the characters as they change. And I see, just in looking behind you, you seem very fashionable. You have, and so can you
My
just
schmatas, they're everywhere. I'm sort of
yes,
they've
but even just
overtaken
the
the
way you
house.
put yourself together, you seem very like fashion is a big part of who you are. So can you talk a little bit about that element of the book, and
Um,
what was fun to write about that? What did you have to learn to do that?
Kind of
Oh,
everything was fun. I did do some research, but I already knew a lot. I have a kind of side hustle where my love for and decades long hunt for vintage clothing, I now started selling it out of my house and at flea markets.
okay.
But I think there's like a deeper meaning here. I think for many women, clothing is not extraneous or window dressing. Clothing is part of who we are and how we construct our identities and how we face the world. Like clothes are really important to us so that they become social markers. They're aspirational. They are, they define us in a certain way. So I feel like in writing about clothes, I am revealing character for many women because it is how we express ourselves. And this goes way, way back. I can remember when I was a little girl, I was bought a little outfit. It was like a little tennis outfit. It was a white dress with a scoop neck and pleated skirt and had a little jacket with red piping. And best of all, there was a pair of tennis rackets in gold, like, stitched on the pocket. This was like the best thing I'd ever seen in my life. So I wear this dress and I'm taken with my father and brother to the parade grounds. We lived in Brooklyn when I was a child, where they played tennis. And I was genuinely like surprised and disappointed that I could not play tennis too. I thought those little tennis rackets, I
Just
thought
give
that
you the
was,
power.
yes, I really thought that. I mean, I was 5, so it's forgivable. But I just tell you that as like a sort of emblematic of how I think clothes do affect many of us. That they seem to give us powers or they make us feel a certain way about ourselves. And that's been true of me my whole life. And I don't think I'm unique in that. I think there are lots of women out there, that feel the same way and could look at a dress in their wardrobe and tell you what happened that night when they wore it, like why it was important to them. Like we do attach those sort of almost talismanic qualities. I mean, women often save their wedding dresses,
Yeah.
right? I have mine. My mother had hers. It was lost to a flood, I'm sorry to say, in a basement in suburban Detroit. But a lot of us have clothes we attach that kind of importance to.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that, because recently I had purchased a dress for my college formal. And it was
Mhm.
one of these dresses, and I went into this very fancy store, which I didn't usually do. And I bought this like simple but elegant black dress. And I remember when I tried it on, the salesperson, I said, "There's no size." She said, "Well, it's like a one size fits some." And so I wore it, and I, was very happy. It was like very simple wrap dress. 35 years later, my daughter was going to her formal for her medical school, and she was shopping in my closet, and I had kept that dress, and she wore it, and it looked perfect on her, and it was
I
like
love
the
it.
classic black dress. So I
Yes.
can
So
totally agree.
we are joined by that, I think.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
linked
So it
by
was
that.
kind of a nice thing to have, and like, just going back to B's story, one of the things that really struck me is that when she's telling her life about being a prostitute, being a madam, one of the things that was so beautiful, what you wrote, was that she was talking about all the different people in her orbit in the world, or in that world, and she said, you know, the details varied, but the underlying thread was the same. We were all women to whom harm had been done. And this really seemed to be true in the brothel, but it also seemed to be true in all of your female characters. You know, each one of them had something done to them, you know, whether it was being forced into prostitution, having to flee their houses, their homes, sexual assault, losing a child. You know, there were all ways in which those women had been harmed, yet they were also very resilient. So can you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
I'm glad you mentioned that line because for me it was sort of the pivotal. I'm getting something that says somebody has started screen sharing. I'm not
Yes,
sure
I'm
if
getting
that's
that as well.
okay. Uh,
So what's happening
okay.
there? So we'll
Um,
just keep talking, and hopefully
okay,
the
that's fine.
people will sort of
Um, that for me was like the pivotal um, understanding of that dynamic is that these were women who'd been hurt, and so the prostitution was in a sense a response to that, you know,
mhm,
some kind of choice to having been hurt. The ways could vary. Uh, and yes, it's true that there are other women in the novel who have been hurt, either by sexual violence or, in one case, I won't say too much, but
yeah,
a physical thing that assaults her that is unique to being female, so that
yes,
that affects her.
yeah,
And I think we are, as women, we just are more vulnerable to that, to
mhm,
sexual violence and that kind of harm. Even with all the progress that has been made, I think it is still very much with us.
yeah,
I
yeah,
and probably always will be with us, but maybe attitudes about it will change,
yeah. Hopefully, I think things
right?
are
I think that yes, I think
yeah,
they have, and they have in my lifetime and in yours. You know,
right,
I am since I'm in New York, I've sort of been following the career, although it ended in disgrace, of Linda Fairstein, who
mhm,
was a prosecutor in New York. And she was the first woman who framed the conversation about rape, first in New York, and then this spread to the whole country, as not blaming the person who was raped.
yeah,
Which was like, that was a radical idea. She said, would you say to a man who'd been robbed, like, why were you wearing that gold watch? What
yeah,
did you think
right,
was going to happen? Did you want to get robbed? Like, really? And that's how rape was treated, that it was your fault. You had done something to deserve that and to bring that on yourself. And that was not that long ago, like 30, 35 years ago that
right,
this changed. And so there
yeah.
has been some change, but as I say, I think it remains with us.
But I like that all of your characters were able to not overcome, well, overcome it, but also sort of find the, I don't want to say the silver lining because there's no silver lining, but they were able to find peace and move forward,
Mhm.
which I think is very hard, and I think you addressed that really well. The other thing that was interesting is that when you were talking about why does someone, like the underlying theme of why you wanted to write this story was, why would someone, a Jewish girl of 21, Caucasian, be a prostitute? And you talked a lot about agency and about how B takes her own agency and chooses that because she feels like if she's going to do it, at least it's in a place where it's legal, at least it's in a place where it's safe, where she doesn't have to do something else until she's no longer able to do that. So can you talk a little bit about that idea, and do you think that's what in your mind drove her to be a good business person?
Absolutely, because I think, again, going back to an issue for women, how little agency was there historically? Some of the research I did, and it was germane to this novel, was that women could own property in New Orleans. And that
Mm.
wasn't true in a lot of
Yeah,
places.
I
Like, you
noticed.
could
Yeah,
not own property, even if you'd inherited it, like your husband got it, or some other male family member got it. Like, you were not going to get that. And that was a place so she could actually buy a house in her own name without anybody else involved. And that was a
hmm,
huge thing.
yeah,
And yes, that does create a sense of agency for someone and gives them some direction over their future. And things happened to her that were not her fault. And
yeah,
so, she had no recourse in those
right.
matters, losing her job and the young man who dies and all of that. Again, I don't want to give too much.
Yeah, we don't want to give too much away. I
But
had to think about how to write the question, so that I wasn't giving.
but yes, and that even the understanding that having been a prostitute, no, being a madam is what gave you the autonomy.
Yeah, right.
Like then you didn't have to do anything you didn't want to do, you know, and you were in a different position. And some of those women, and I did research them, became extremely wealthy.
Mm.
You know, again at a time when that was not common. I'm not saying that I think this is a good thing necessarily, but it was a thing. You
It was
know,
something for them to do, that they could do, and that
that's right.
that was
And it
sort
was
of one of the avenues they had for them.
exactly, and it was in response to other kinds of restrictions that,
Yeah.
you know, prevented them from doing something else that would have given them that autonomy.
Was New Orleans the only place where prostitution was legal in the U.S.?
Um, you know, it still is in Reno, in Nevada, and I
Okay.
don't know about the history of Nevada, but yes, at the time it was one of the only place I knew of, you know, and certainly the place with the most reputation. And it ended very abruptly in 1917 when the United States got into the First World War. New Orleans was a big port city, soldiers, sailors flooding the city, and there is simply too much temptation for these boys. Like,
Okay.
and they disappear, they get drunk, they get syphilis, and the federal government comes in and says, okay, we're going to stop this. And there's a lot of pushback because now it's been legal for 20 plus years, or almost 20 years, and it is a big part of the economy. And there are all these ancillary businesses that
Right.
are crop up alongside it, like music and cafes. And I mean, just a little interesting sidebar. I didn't deal with this at all, but jazz picks up and leaves New Orleans in
Oh,
1917 because all those places where, you know, remember, people, if they wanted to hear music, they had to go hear live music, and all those places that catered to people who either the customers at the brothels or the workers, the prostitutes themselves, that was all gone. So they had, like, Louis Armstrong leaves New Orleans and goes up north. So they go to Chicago or New York.
okay.
So, and the federal government does prevail. And as a result, you know, the city changes and all those beautiful mansions were torn down. There is
Oh.
not one that remains. Because I did an actual research trip to New Orleans when I was writing this book. And I found this woman, she was a friend of a friend, and she was a tour guide. And I wrote to her and told her what I was looking for, what I wanted to see. And she created a custom tour for me.
Oh, nice.
And when we went along Basin Street, where the train doesn't even run anymore, now the train station is in a different part of the city, not one of those buildings is there. Not
Wow.
one. The only thing I found from that is still there is like this little brick building on a corner that was a luncheonette or a bar.
Mm.
Like it's complete, looks like nothing. I mean, you wouldn't even.
What's there now?
Different buildings, you know, mainly larger buildings, you know, apartment buildings, hotels, but none of those houses. I've seen pictures of them, interiors, exteriors, and they are very grand. But I think the city wanted to distance itself from that past, and so like when that change was made, the physical evidence of it was going to be, you know, obliterated.
Right, right. You did an amazing job of describing the texture and the feel of both cities, New Orleans and New York. And I was listening to something and I heard that you originally were going to place most of the book in New Orleans.
I was.
And then that changed. So can you talk a little bit about how the writing process or the storyline evolved?
Yes, I am someone who works very quickly. I have to get a draft out. It's like a mosquito bite that I'm scratching, and and then I have to write lots of drafts because those early drafts are not necessarily the ones that I'm going to be happiest with. But in this case, it was my editor who felt that the New York, originally I had Bea and Alice come to New York only at the very end of the novel, and there was maybe one chapter in New York, or two, I forget. And she said, you know, I actually think that it's working better in New York than it is in New Orleans, and I think you should do more of it here. And so I thought about how to do that, and then there were some other character or plot changes. I had originally had Bea become an abortionist, first fostering abortions for women, you know, allowing them to happen at her premises, and because that too was such a fraught thing. And there is someone in this novel who dies from a botched abortion, which happened then like a lot. I don't know what the statistics were, but it was a dangerous thing to do. And somehow that led me down a path that I found I didn't really want to be going in. And anyway, I had to work my way out of that into something else. So it was set, it is ultimately became more of a New York book than a New Orleans book.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because of there was so much of the mother child longing, loss, sort of, there was, I don't want to give away too much, but that theme was so ripe in the book about whether you lost a child, however it happened, or to reclaim it, and then also orphans, and what's that impact? Because at some point, many of the characters were orphans, right? At some
Mhm.
point in lives, but there was it ends up in a positive way. So can you talk a little bit about what drew you to that theme?
That was kind of a surprise to me. I wasn't planning on it or intending it. And how do I say this without being a spoiler? But there is a character who I was not intending to have in the book except off stage. And again, my editor prompted me and said, I think you're missing a dramatic opportunity here, and I think you should bring this character in. And I spent a couple of weeks like grumbling around my house thinking, I don't know who she is. I don't know what she wants. I didn't want to write her. She's not supposed to be in this book. And then suddenly, this happens to me enough times, doesn't happen all the time and consistently, but like I hear a voice in my head, and suddenly this woman was talking to me about who she was and her longing for a child that she did not have. And like suddenly I understood her and I knew her story and I couldn't wait to write her. And she was, she became possibly the most interesting thing to me in this novel, although I
Yeah.
didn't anticipate it. To say that mothers and daughters are, or sons, are a big theme, hardly unique to me. It is a major theme.
Yeah.
I, not that I feel like a woman has to have children, but if you do, like in a sense, they define you. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like a huge thing to have children, whether you raise them or not. Like
Right.
whether they, like you just are changed by that. And I, I don't even know why I found my way to that. I was drawn to that. I was very fortunate in my own life as a mother. I had children like right, I got pregnant right away, and I had children easily, and like they're fine. Knock wood. We
Thank
always say
God, knock on wood.
right?
That's
Like so, I
right.
didn't have any of that,
Right.
and yet, like somehow the feelings around it like were deep in me too, and sort of bubbling up.
Well, you really wrote about it with it was very emotional, just the way that you wrote about that aspect of the story on every level, just from all the different ways that someone can want and lose a child in different ways. So
Thank you. I had hoped to do that, and I really wanted to kind of go there.
right. And it was also interesting how you wrote about sort of miscommunication, because ultimately there were a lot of characters, which in life and in many books there's always the problem of people who don't understand and make assumptions, and that drives their actions, and a lot of times the actions that it gets them into trouble until they understand like what's really going on. So can you talk a little bit about if that was something that you were trying to show as well?
Um, Absolutely. That, and especially in a time where people didn't talk about things as
Mhm.
readily as we talk about them now. That was a big kind of cultural difference. I think I don't think I know that the way those conversations, not even were framed, they didn't happen. I think
Mhm.
you were told you're not supposed to talk about this, and so when that is the case, there's so much possibility for miscommunication and
Mhm.
misunderstanding of motive and intent because you're not talking about it.
Right.
No?
And you've said that your grandmother told you about her story. Did she tell you the full extent of her story, or did you
Uh,
learn that later?
she did in bits and pieces. I found myself not wanting to listen a lot of times when she told me things, and only later, after she was gone, I thought, why didn't you ask her more questions? Why didn't you listen?
It was like
Like
that.
then I became really interested, but in bits and pieces. And she lost three children. And she was told when the first one uh, died, and it was in like a really freaky way that did not have to happen. she was told, don't think about it, have another baby. Like,
Mm,
you know, I think we understand now, like that is not going to work. Like until
yeah.
you can sort of own the grief and move through it, you're not going to be able to let it go. And that was not helpful for her.
Mm,
She was 18 years old and she lost this baby and was told,
yeah.
just don't think about it. Have another
Right.
one. You know, I mean, it's not like a kitten or a pair of gloves. I think I
Right.
even said
Right.
that in the book about something else. Like,
Yeah.
just replace it. You know, um, you have to feel that before you can come to any sense of peace or acceptance about it.
Right. Well, it seems like you were channeling your grandmother in that character
I
that you talked
was.
about.
And I felt really sorry for her
Yeah.
that she did not have anyone to say that or help her. I remember very shortly after my son was born, and I didn't even know that I wanted children, to be honest with you. I was not a woman who was like pining to have
Yeah.
children or thinking about it. But I got to a certain point in my life and my marriage, I thought, well, if we're going to do it, we should do it now. And I got pregnant right away, and I had this baby. And it was kind of like that moment in The Wizard of Oz where everything goes into color. I thought like,
Yeah.
oh my God, I could have missed this. Like, I'm so
Yeah.
glad I didn't. And I said to my husband when he was like a tiny little thing, I said, like I didn't even, like, I didn't yearn for him. I didn't think about him. He's only been here a few weeks. And if something happened to him, I would like, I would be devastated. I would
Of
not,
course.
I could, like, how did that happen? That like something I didn't even really think about much could have such an impact in my life. And so for her to have gone through that was so sad that
Yeah.
she didn't have anyone to talk to about it, or not in a way that seemed very helpful.
Right. So it makes sense why she was so angry because she never
Yes,
was able
it,
to deal with her feelings.
yes.
And that sort of, that early trauma kind of carries forward if you don't deal with it.
And in her
Really,
case, she also felt guilty. Something I think is probably, I don't know if it's true of all mothers, certainly Jewish mothers, like all those
yeah.
jokes and stereotypes, but we do tend to feel guilty about things and things. And so she felt that the deaths of these children, and there were three, were her fault. And
Right.
nothing would persuade her otherwise. Nothing. All those, she died in her 90s. She still felt like it was her fault those babies died.
Yeah. That's very sad. Yeah. But
It is very sad.
yeah, but you can understand it. You also described anti-Semitism in different periods, sort of in the late 1800s when she goes back to her time in Russia, and then in the 1920s we're still seeing a little bit of it peeking its head in New York, and then also just kind of what's going on in the world today. So can you talk a little bit about how you were interested in anti-Semitism and how true that was to the times?
Well, I think it was true to those times and to all times. I don't know the age range. I'm not seeing everybody, but I feel like some people will recognize this. There was a comedian named Tom Lehrer who used to sing his comedy, and there was a song in which I think that the lyrics go, the Catholics hate the Protestants hate the Catholics, the Lutherans hate the Methodists, and everyone hates the Jews. And I sang that. I thought that was hilarious to my own children, who also thought it was hilarious. It's just true. I mean, we have been hated historically. And I think there's a particular aspect to this in the West, because, like, putting aside, and this is a lot of the world to put aside, the East, which was not Christian largely, um, but in the West, everybody got on the Christian bandwagon, and not us. We just didn't. Like
Yeah.
all that pageantry, all those stories, it's like we were, kind of culturally, Bartleby the Scrivener standing outside of that and saying, thank you, we'd rather not.
Yeah.
And it continues to interest me and engage me. I think, like, why? Why didn't we? And I deeply believe that it has informed our sense of ourselves, historically and culturally, that we are singular in that way. We just didn't, and
Right.
still don't. Like, we are Western, but we are not Christian, and we are not going
Right.
to be Christian. And there's a resistance to that on the outside, like people, and a misunderstanding about it. And I, I have thoughts as to why, but it doesn't really matter. I think that it is always going to be true, that we are always going to occupy that sort of marginal space. And as an assimilated Jew myself, and I married a man who wasn't Jewish,
Mm.
I'm always sort of coming into contact with that. Uh,
Right.
and And it interests me, like, how are we as Jews going to be in this wider world? Still as Jews, but, not entirely accepted in some places, and these, like forever. I think this is
Right.
just going to be with us,
No,
unfortunately.
I think it's true. Now you were born in Israel. When did you
Mhm.
come to the US, and how
Um,
does that, and your
uh,
Israeli background, how does that inform your view?
um, well, my parents are American. They were from the Midwest, and they met at a Zionist youth movement called Habonim. And my mother was 15 when they met. My father was, I don't know, 18 or 19. And my father dropped out of the University of Michigan. He was the first in his family to go to college, to go to Israel in 1949. And
Mm.
his mother, the grandmother I never really knew, she died when I was very young, but she said to him, Israel, what's in Israel? Sand, shit, and flies. Which I think is a great line, and I have used many times in my life. I think I would have liked this grandmother a lot. Uh, but my father went and my mother followed him, and they lived there for 9 years. I have an older brother who was born on a kibbutz. By the time I was born, they moved to a moshav in Hadera. And, Israel being such a small country and such a Hamish one in a way, I was once in a cab and I got to talking to the cab driver, and he'd been born in Hadera too. And we figured out we were born in the same hospital. Like, because there's only
Wow.
one. There was only one then, there's only one now. And that was it. We were both born in it. So that was fun, like a little connection. But they came here when I was a baby. So I didn't remember Israel. My older brother did. He came here not speaking any English. I only knew Israel as a kind of mythic place that had really been very compelling for my parents. And I didn't go there again until I was 18.
Okay.
And I really loved it and thought I would stay. That didn't happen. I'm sorry, what was it? I also lost
Well,
my.
the question was just being in Israel. The question was, when did you come to the US, and then did
Oh, yes.
your Israeli background inform your views or your writing?
Well, it was funny because my father, who was kind of a quasi socialist, like he did not want to participate in the Jewish life that would have been around us then. I
Okay.
lived in Brooklyn and there was a Jewish center, and all the families of my friends were members of it. And, the boys, back then there weren't so many bat mitzvahs, but all the boys went to Hebrew school for the bar mitzvah. And my father wouldn't do any of that. And it pained me as a child. Like I wanted to be part of that.
Mm.
And, he had Zionism for him was what defined being Jewish, which I, have come to understand that better now. But I didn't grow up in Israel, so it was very abstract for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
But yes, I am Israeli by birth. I have an Israeli passport.
Yeah.
Because I went to Israel, I had to have one. I had to register with the draft board. I have an Israeli birth certificate. So I am an Israeli.
Right. But it sounds like you didn't necessarily fit in. You don't necessarily identify with the Zionist Israel or the American Jewish community that was happening in Brooklyn.
Um, Probably not, though. Maybe more of the Zionism. I mean,
Yeah.
I find that the anti-Zionist talk I hear now, and there's a lot of it,
Mm.
it's just like another version of anti-Semitism. It's like a way to be anti-Semitic, but to
Right.
also seem righteous.
Right.
Like
Right.
you wouldn't say certain stereotypical things about Jews, that we've heard in the past, right?
Right.
Greedy, money grubbing, Christ
Yeah.
killer. Okay, you know enough not to say that, but you can say racist, oppressor,
Right.
those things, and be considered
Okay.
acceptable in certain,
Right.
you know, uh, situations and aspects. And, uh, you know, to me, like if you look at the map, and there's this like tiny little spot that's Israel, surrounded on all sides by hostile neighbors who have said, some of them, we think the border should be the Mediterranean, that there should be no Israel at
Yeah.
all.
Right.
Like, you want to say, come on, guys, like, give us
Yeah.
a little, and by the way, it was like nobody wanted it. Like what did my grandmother say about it? Like, it's this little spot in the desert. Who even wants this? So,
Right.
like, let us have this.
Yeah. Have your books been translated into Hebrew?
No, unfortunately, I would like that.
Yeah.
I don't have much control over that. I know
Right.
that's like a thing. Like,
Yeah, that's another thing. So let's talk a little bit. One of the in the questions in the chat box is that I think it was Joe said that he really liked the Irish immigrant characters, and he really liked their stories even a little bit more than the Jewish prostitute stories. So can you talk a little bit about that side of it, and that type of, just how you describe that and why that was important to you to bring those in.
I've always had a thing for Irish Catholics, particularly boys. My first boyfriend was an Irish Catholic boy in college, and my
Okay.
husband is Irish Catholic. So
Okay, there you go.
I,
So you have that
I
friend.
kind of, was immersed in that. And in fact, he came from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I would tease him that he was a WASP. And he said, darling, I'm not a WASP. I'm a Catholic. It's
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
But to me, he was very WASPy. He had an Aunt Elspeth. I saw her tombstone in the family, in the plot in the cemetery. Like, it was pretty waspy to me. But it's just something I feel kind of akin to because of him and his big family,
Right.
that I've gotten to know well over the years.
And they seemed much more accepting and just sort of inclusive, bringing everyone into the fold.
Well, that particular family, yes. And the Irish face similar kinds of exclusions. You'd think that, from the outside as Jews looking in, you think, well, they're both Christian.
Yeah.
But like, no, the Catholics and the Protestants have, profound differences. How many, I mean, I don't think they're different, but they do. And how many people
Right.
have been burned or beheaded, and how much blood shed over this little thing, right? Like the Catholics believe that transubstantiation is a miracle and it happens every time you take the Eucharist. And the Protestants say, no, it's just a symbol. It's not really the blood. It's not really the body. How many people have died for this, little point here, right?
And even Meredith, she says, oh, it's, when Catherine wants to marry somebody who's Irish, she's upset about that. And then she's like, well, thank God it's not a Jew.
Right.
So
Right, in a hierarchy of things.
Yeah,
The Jew is worse than the Irish, but
Right.
it's down market if you're
Right.
a certain kind of person.
One of the things I was wondering about the barrels, they had a stationery store. That was what was their livelihood. But they seemed to be very well off at that time. Would a stationery store earn that much income?
Well, it could have. It was in Manhattan. It was big. I didn't really delve into that. I mean, they were not very, very wealthy, but a house in Brooklyn wasn't such a kind of extraordinary thing to have.
That's what it is today. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like it is today. It wasn't like they didn't live on Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue or Sutton Place,
Right.
like that. They lived in Brooklyn. They didn't even live in Manhattan.
I got it. Okay, so there was a difference there.
Oh yeah.
So Tracy Wright wanted to know what kind of racism or anti-Semitism have you yourself experienced?
I think the garden variety that most of us have, but I will tell you a story that seemed to me most emblematic of what I have faced is I went to college in the 1970s. I went to Vassar, and there were plenty of Jews in the student body and Jews in the faculty, but I was aware that it was a very waspy place, kind of like a tsunami of wasps, and whom I'd never met before. The Gentiles in my childhood were Irish Catholic or Italian Catholic. It was a different thing, if we're talking, it's class as well as religion. And although I loved Vassar and felt very lucky to have gone there, and it was a very intellectually stimulating place, I was aware of the fact that historically I would not have gone there. Jewish girls were not going there in any great numbers until maybe the 1960s or 70s. There were quotas.
Right.
And, this is, quite known now. So while I was there, I studied art history. It was a lovely thing to study. It's a really good department. And I was a good student. I went to all the lectures and talks and things. And I went to a lecture one night about Rococo painting. I don't know if you're not familiar with it. It's very frothy and light.
Yes.
Lots of girls in satin dresses with lace kicking off their shoes to their besotted lover down on the ground.
Yeah.
And I had with me a friend who was in the political science department, and I got her to go with me. So we go to this lecture, and the professor is a visiting professor from Germany. And this is in the 1970s, so the war's not so far behind us. And they're talking about, like, what his background is and his history. And I don't know what I expected to hear about the war years, but what I hear is that he was a high-ranking general in the army. And like, I was not very woke, but that kind of gave me pause. And my friend, who was much more woke, like poked me and said, this man's a Nazi. Like, you don't get to be that unless you are.
Right.
So we got to go. So we get up and we make a fuss and annoy everybody, getting out of, leaving the lecture. And we spent the whole evening talking about it. filled with the righteous indignation of that only a 20-year-old can have.
Right.
And so the next morning, I march over to the art history department and I ask if I can see the chairman, and I tell her my story, like, why is this man invited here? She said, actually, we didn't invite him. It was the German department. Okay, righteous indignation still not extinguished. I march across campus and go to the German department, ask to see the chairman there, and I'm shown into his office and I tell him my story. And he listens very patiently. He's a polite, nice man. And I said, so what did you think, some of us were gonna feel about that?
Yeah.
He said, quite honestly, we didn't think about it.
Interesting.
Whoa. Like your history, your identity, I don't even see it. Doesn't even exist for me. Like that you're a young Jewish woman and you might have thoughts about not wanting to listen to anything a Nazi has to say about any subject. That was the most shocking to me. Like that, I don't know if you could call it anti-Semitism. It was like, you just don't exist.
Just ignorance, really.
Right.
And was at the time, how many Jews were there at Vassar? Do you know?
I don't know, but it felt like certainly enough. Like
Right.
I didn't feel strange in that. I didn't.
Right. You didn't feel like you were the only person there.
Right.
And after you had that conversation, did he pause and say, oh, you know what? We probably shouldn't have done that. That maybe wasn't such a great idea. Or did you just be like, yeah, we didn't think about it? And
Yeah, like I don't know. He did not say we shouldn't have. He just, he was sorry I was upset. He was a polite man, but he just.
But he didn't care. He didn't really care.
Yeah, like it just wasn't something that was going to register with him.
Mm-hmm.
And that for me was very shocking.
Yeah.
Because to me it seemed like such a big thing.
Yeah. Right. But I think that still happens today.
Yes, I think it does.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it definitely does. I want to see if there's any other questions in the chat that I've missed.
So, I haven't looked because I can't really talk and look.
No, I can't either.
So I apologize.
So I'm trying to see if there's anything that I've missed. I think I got that. All right. So tell us what you're working on next.
I am working on a book about, it takes place in the 1940s and at Vassar, and it's about anti-Semitism.
There you go. Is that scene going to be in there with you marching in?
No, not that particular scene, but there's a Jewish girl at Vassar in the 1940s when it's less common, and she makes a decision about how to present herself in that world, and that has far-reaching impacts in her life. So okay. I am, as I said, continually drawn back there. I have children. As I mentioned, a son who's 32 this week, and he said to me, Mom, you always want to know who's Jewish. And I said, you bet I do. Like what I was describing to you before, like our singularity historically. He moves through the world with a name that is not Jewish. He has his father's name, his Irish Catholic father's name. I said, you, in effect, can pass. Nobody makes the assumption that you're Jewish. And in fact, he's told me about anti-Semitic things that have been said in his presence by people who don't realize he's Jewish, so they feel perfectly comfortable in saying those things.
And does he feel the same indignation? Does he feel the same visceral response to it?
My son is unlike me. He's so cool. It's like really hard to rile him. He lets people know, but he does not appear to be upset by it. It's like really hard to upset him. You have to really work. Like to make a particular campaign to upset this young man. He just, that's how he came out. And that's how he's been his whole life.
That's good.
It is. I like to say I have a son who lives his life like this and a daughter who's like that. Like I can tell 30 seconds, 3 seconds when I pick up the phone and it's her like what kind of conversation it's going to be. Because she is.
Did she go to Vassar? Did either of them go to Vassar?
No, my son said, that's a girls' school. I said, actually, not since 1975. It's been co-ed. And no, my daughter didn't feel like it was the right place for her, and she didn't apply there.
Yeah. Renee wants to know, and I actually do as well, why do you write under a pseudonym?
Well, it wasn't my decision. It was my publisher's decision. But I will now tell you the story because it actually does pertain to what I have been talking about. Being a Jewish girl in a waspy world. So when I got to Vassar, my name was Yona Zeldis, and then it became Yona Zeldis McDonough when I married Paul McDonough. Okay. So when I got to Vassar, and I, this name just didn't seem to fit. So I said to a good friend of mine there, who actually was my professor It was my last year in school and his first year teaching. So there weren't very many years that separated us,
Yeah.
like 8 years. And I said, Jonas Zeldis does not belong at Vassar. Catherine Ann Worthington belongs at Vassar. And he said, Kitty, he's been calling me that since 1978. Still my friend. And as it happened, I get to know a lot of people through him, and they all call me Kitty. So it has been my nickname for many, many years. And then HarperCollins felt that since the previous book, wait, I have it right here, and it is very much thematically related. It's also about anti-Semitism in the post-war period, Not Our Kind.
Not Our Kind, okay.
So that was the first historical novel that I wrote. They felt that I could use a relaunch with a new name. And they didn't ask me. They told me. They said, we're going to do this. Okay. So they let me keep Zeldis, which was my maiden name. And Kitty, I mean, I knew it was going to be Kitty because I'm already Kitty. Like when someone says Kitty, I look up. Like, it's me. So that became the nom de plume.
Okay.
And I'm very happy with it.
Yeah, that's a nice name. It is. It also kind of seems very 1920s. I don't know, for some reason it just, maybe I'm thinking of Zelda.
Yeah, someone else has said that to me too. So maybe, right. But anyway, so that's where that came from.
Okay, well and so you're if we wanted to find books in your other name or previous, it would be Jonas
Zeldis McDonough, which is a lot of name.
That is a lot of name.
It is a lot of name, but it is mine.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to know. So I will look them up in that. And I guess it would be too confusing if you retroactively went back and changed them back to Kitty Zeldis to all of them.
I wouldn't even have the opportunity to do that because that would be, the books would have to be reissued.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
And I am not in control of that, Right. So no, I think I could just leave them as they are. I have social media accounts with both names. They kind of feed into each other.
Yes,
so, it's not a state secret.
And I think if they find Zeldis, they'll find, it'll connect anyway because that's
right. It's an unusual name, and particularly spelled with the I and not the E. And I find that when someone has that name, if I encounter them, we're usually related in some tangential way. We have some sister in common.
Right. Okay. That's awesome. Is your mom still alive?
She is.
Has she read this book as sort of the ode to her? Because it was to her mother, right?
Right. She's not been able to read this book. She is not in a condition where she can read any longer. I'm sorry to say. This is Sam. Excuse me. I'm just going to, actually, it's not. I'm going to call you right back, okay? So that was my daughter, the one person call I will always take.
My daughter texted me in the middle of this as well. We're trying to call.
Right. You get to have that with your mom.
Yes.
Right. Exactly. Like you get to have your mom's attention. I think that's beautiful.
All right, great. Well, I think we answered all of the questions. Did Randy, Karen, did we miss anything else? No, great. Well, thank you. This has been
Thank you so much, Kitty. This was fantastic.
Well,
really fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Let me know if those book plates got there.
We
Absolutely.
did. We got them. Wait till you see. Look at this.
Oh, so cute.
How great is that?
My husband bought me that stamp.
I love it so much.
Years before this book happened. But when I went through my stamps, I thought, perfect.
It's so perfect. We thank you so much, Kitty, and thank you so much, Lisa, for your great questions. Kitty, that was super entertaining. Please, everyone, there's a link to purchase the book, The Dressmakers of Prospect Heights, in the chat, and we also will send it with the link on Friday, and we'll send it again with our thank you later today. And we appreciate your time so much and wish you a lot of luck.
Thank you.
Have a good
Everyone
day,
have a wonderful afternoon.
All right, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye,
Lisa.
everyone.
Thank you, Kitty.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.